We now have a lot of more aggressive cross-border incursions by allied Ukrainian forces into Russia, along with Biden reversing himself yet again and saying he would send F-16 fighter jets after refusing. How do you assess the actual danger of escalation in terms of the possibility of some direct U.S.-Russia military conflict, even as an episodic misperception, and ultimately the longer-term risks of things like all-out war between the West and Russia?
Well, the risks are extremely high because we have a very determined Biden administration that wants to keep escalating. Russia is absolutely determined to prevent NATO from enlarging to Ukraine for understandable reasons, in my view. It's a 1,900-kilometer border of Ukraine, and Russia does not want the U.S. military alliance on its border. And so as long as the Biden administration and the media that are absolutely supporting it and disguising the basic facts continue to push this NATO enlargement, we're going to have an escalating war. This war was completely avoidable. The party in this conflict that actually sought diplomacy repeatedly was Russia. Not something you'd read in the New York Times, actually, but the fact. And it was Russia that put on the table on December 17th, 2021, a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to forestall the war. I actually called the White House. Soon afterwards, I said, you've got the basis to negotiate. Avoid this war. And I was told, no, we're not going to discuss NATO enlargement. That's our business. It's not Russia's business. And I said, are you kidding? This is going to cause a massive and very dangerous war. No, this is our policy and so forth. You could ask the question, if they did a little thought experiment, how would the Biden administration think about Russia establishing military bases in Mexico? Probably not thrilled. They probably wouldn't say, well, that's Mexico's choice. What are we going to do about it? So a little bit of thinking and empathy might have gone a long way. But we have heard almost nothing about it in your expertise, which I'm just amazed at day by day how the New York Times and other mainstream media twist all of this. I recently asked an assistant of mine, please do a scan for the last 2 years of the editorial pages of the New York Times. 26 times the idea of unprovoked invasion has been raised by the New York Times in its editorials, in its opinion columns of the New York Times columnists like Tom Friedman and others, and in the invited op-eds. And you just can't get a word in. Otherwise, you can't tell that readership you were just describing in Manhattan, where I happen to live, what's really going on. So this is the frightening part. And we're also told, Glenn, which is pretty damn weird, don't worry about nuclear escalation. Don't be blackmailed by this. My advice is worry and worry a lot. And if you have been around these issues for a while, and I have for decades, and I wrote a book about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's successful quest to negotiate a partial nuclear test ban treaty with Nikita Khrushchev, if you're not worried, you just don't get it, because you better be worried. And I'm very worried about this administration not getting it.
It was such a staple of Cold War culture, Cold War policy, that avoiding nuclear war was the single greatest priority as we were going around the world with these proxy conflicts against the Soviet Union. We managed never to directly engage them militarily. And even then, misperception, miscommunication did bring the world close to nuclear annihilation, at least on 2 occasions, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And yet it really does amaze me that we seem to have just kind of through, inertia or lethargy or historical ignorance, come to view the risk of nuclear war as basically a fiction, as kind of assigning zero value to it, or even this kind of macho attitude that we're not going to be deterred by a country having nuclear weapons. Talk a little bit about, in the time that you've been working in all the things that I discussed in these kind of geopolitical framework, even from an economics perspective, the specter of nuclear war and how it used to be kind of important for people and policymakers in deciding what they would and wouldn't do.
There was one moment when Biden was caught on tape saying, we're on a path to Armageddon. This is, I think it was the fall of 2021, if I remember.
No, 2022.
2022. Sorry, I'm sorry, 2022. Excuse me. And he was excoriated by the press the next day, rather than anybody reflecting. Oh my God, the president of the United States is saying this. He was excoriated. How dare he say this? He let a tiny glimmer of the truth in. And then, of course, the whole idea was shut that up. Don't talk about that. Well, anyone that knows some history, and by the way, if you want to know some history, the most wonderful book written about this by a great historian is a book called Gambling with Armageddon by a late, great historian, Martin Sherwin, who wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole atomic age, in fact. And the book is terrifying because we came so close 60 years ago, actually 61 years ago now, to nuclear annihilation. And almost every one of Kennedy's aides would have pushed us to that. We fortunately had a president who had the sense to avoid the ultimate disaster, but almost none of his aides had that sense. And what Sherwin recalls and what we've learned from Dan Ellsberg and from so many others is how close we've come and how easy it is to come close because there's so many stupid people in our government. Believe me, this is something I can tell you absolutely. People who don't think, who are extraordinarily lacking in basic common sense, who believe that power is the only coin of the realm, who believe you really do have to be tough on whatever it is, and nuclear war will see them down. And all of this is extraordinarily reckless, and we're really in it now. And it's, of course, not just Ukraine. It's Nancy Pelosi flying to Taiwan. It's us doing whatever we can to humiliate China. It's having an absurd G7 meeting last week in Hiroshima, of all places, that the U.S., of course, bombed with the first nuclear atomic bomb, spending the whole G7, in essence, to attack China and Russia. They think it plays politics. They think it's a game. It's extraordinarily reckless and extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily predictable what's going on.
Yeah.
Because the real diplomats inside the U.S. have been warning about this for decades. We're only finding some of it out by WikiLeaks and by disclosures such as Bill Burns, their CIA director, who was in 2008 the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he sent a memo that everybody should read.
To Condoleezza Rice.
2008, yeah, he explained, my God, this NATO enlargement business is absolutely dangerous. And of course, George Kennan a decade earlier, and George Kennan was absolutely brilliant and understood already in the 50s how we could have gotten out of the Cold War. But certainly in 1997, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, when they still ran such op-eds, that this whole NATO enlargement business was absolutely reckless. And what's interesting, when Kennan was writing that in 1997, I hadn't actually realized it until I went back and saw a reference to an article in Foreign Affairs by Zbig Brzezinski that I didn't remember. writing in 1997, laying out almost the precise timetable for how we were going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. Now, this is years before Putin's president. This is when we're not having any war with Russia. People tell me, oh, yeah, well, they have to be in NATO. Look at Putin, madman. But this is well before, and Brzezinski lays out basically to the year the sequence of how it's going to be the first row of countries, which was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. Then it's going to be the next row. Then Ukraine by 2005 to 2010, he writes, they're going to have their invitation. It turned out to be 2008. Our ambassador to NATO in 2008 was none other than Victoria Nuland. If you want to know what deep state means, she's been in every administration. She's been almost every night.
Except when Trump was elected. That's the only way apparently to get her out of the government.
Except Trump.
Yeah.
So she was Cheney's advisor. She was ambassador to NATO when we asked Ukraine to come in. She was the point person on the U.S. engagement in the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, which started the war in Ukraine. And she is now promoted for all of this, bringing us ever closer to disaster. And by the way, putting Ukraine in the classic place in a proxy war guaranteed to destroy that country, which is exactly what it's doing.
You know, the thing that struck me so much about that Bill Burns memo in 2008 when he was warning Condoleezza Rice and others in the Bush administration about the insanity of this plan was he said, it isn't just Putin. You go and talk to every single person of influence in Moscow, even Putin's liberal critics, and it's all, for every last one of them, a huge red line to be mucking around in Ukraine for the West, in part because of the history of the 20th century. And that's what I wanted to ask you. You gave this interview in February of 2023 with Isaac Chadner of The New Yorker, who has become this hero to the liberal establishment because of these adversarial interviews he purportedly does. A lot of it is based on how transcripts get edited, how much he gets to say, how much the guest gets to say. I've done a couple of those with him, so I know firsthand. One of the points
what a low life approach to journalism.
Completely. I mean, mine I felt ended up being pretty fair, but I've seen him done incredible hatchet jobs with others, including yours, because one of the points you kept trying to make was that the premises of his questions, embedded in them, they were almost like, when did you stop beating your wife questions, were so misguided because he was distorting the history of the conflict, in part by thinking the war began either in 2022 or even in 2014 with Crimea, and you kept pointing it out, actually the start of the war is 2013 with this change of government that he was shocked you called a coup, or even before with NATO expansion, even before it got to Ukraine. So talk about those parts of the history that the New York Times, the New Yorker editors didn't allow you to have included in that article, and why you think that history is so important to understanding how we're being propagandized about the conflict now.
Well, it's a little amazing to be the New Yorker of all places. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say of all places, but Remnick's New Yorker is absolutely neocon, beginning to end. The New York Times is completely neocon. I don't know if they would be, by the way, if I can't figure it out if it's just anti-Trump, pro-Biden, or they really believe the stuff that they say, but they're absolutely unwilling to listen or to learn a fact. The thing that surprised me about Chotiner was just how he knew nothing and kept making aggressive assertions. And when you tried to say something, it was just snark. So it was a really weird experience.
Well, he's playing to that audience that loves it. Like, you know, they assume all of his assumptions that he's getting from the New York Times. That's the full extent of their worldview. You kept trying to inject an alternative historical understanding, but it never made it into the article, which is why I'd love for you to offer it now about the importance of 2013 and that change of government, and even kind of going back to when NATO started expanding after the reunification of Germany eastward toward the Soviet or toward Russia.
Well, you know, I posted a piece on Common Dreams, which people can take a look at to get a lot of the hyperlinks and a lot of the underlying data and evidence. But this story really goes back 34 years. It goes back to 1989, 1990. The U.S. and Germany were both very clear to Gorbachev, who was a godsend for the world, by the way, because he really was a man of peace. And I was profoundly honored to try to help him on the economic side, though the White House was having none of it at the time. But in any event, Gorbachev believed in peace, and he unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet side NATO. And Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated time and again to Gorbachev, and in many, many different forms, and so did the NATO Secretary General and others, we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. We won't do it. Now, I spoke to a wonderful historian who is working on this right now, who tells me that in the archives he's come across in 1992, not only the plans for NATO expansion, but Ukraine already on the list for NATO expansion in 1992, when supposedly in the public there is no such thing as NATO expansion at all. But remember 1992, that was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld in the Bush senior administration. I thought, what could be worse? Well, we kept learning things can get worse.
Right.
Even and in the Democratic Party, the love affair with the so-called liberal hegemony. I don't know what the liberal part is, but I know what the hegemony part is. That has been Nuland's thing, and of course her husband Robert Kagan's thing for decades. This has been underway since the early 1990s. Now, the Russians have been saying, and Gorbachev said, don't move eastward. We want peace. We want openness. I was actually advisor to Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. I've seen all of these people. You know what they wanted? They wanted normal life. They wanted to stop the Cold War. They did not want crazy things. They wanted normalcy. And we wouldn't give it. What we said, normalcy, yeah, that's U.S. hegemony. That's U.S. indispensable power. That's U.S. we do what we want anywhere we want when we want it. And that has been the story all along. And frankly, I couldn't imagine it at the time because I was watching with my own eyes as a young guy. Suddenly, the world had a chance for peace. And peace didn't mean U.S. global hegemony. Peace meant normal cooperation, but we couldn't accept the deal of just being normal and cooperative. We had to say, now we lead on everything. And that's been the story since the beginning. Now, there are many steps to it. Clinton was the first violator of the promises, and Clinton's so inconsistent on everything, but this is one of the things he was inconsistent on. So the first NATO expansion took place under Clinton, and that was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. The next NATO expansion, 7 countries by Bush Jr. in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. So you had the Baltic states, you had Romania and Bulgaria. You're starting to, right up against Russia, Slovakia and Slovenia. Now, Putin says in 2007, stop already, stop. He says it in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. We don't listen at all. 2008, Bush says NATO is going to enlarge to Ukraine. The European leaders, by the way, were aghast. And one of the European top leaders at the time called me, said, what is your president doing? Of course, European leaders don't say any of this publicly, but they say privately, this is crazy. This is so dangerous. But of course, they were quiet. Bush pushed this through in 2008. Then there was a reprieve for Ukraine. the reprieve was that the president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, look, we're in between two giants. We don't want to be smashed in the middle. We take neutrality. But neutrality was a red flag for Victoria Nuland and her friends. And so at the end of 2013, when demonstrations against the decision that Yanukovych had made to postpone signing an agreement with EU started protests, believe me, the U.S. covertly and overtly and every other way stirred that up massively. But in January and February 2014, they supported a violent insurrection that overthrew Yanukovych. And of course, notoriously, Nuland was caught on tape, something we don't talk about, but anyone go listen to it.
She picked the next leader. She picked the new leader.
She's planning the government weeks before the overthrow, calling exactly who would be the prime minister, by the way. It's amazing. But the whole thing is amnesia. Don't talk about any of this, though it's so obvious. And I had a weird experience personally, which was that when the government was overthrown and Yanukovych fled and Yatsenyuk was prime minister, just as Nuland said, I got a call. Yatsenyuk wants to meet you. It's a deep economic crisis. Okay, I actually respond to those things when a government says we're in a very deep financial crisis. So I flew to Kiev. And I had an NGO brag to me about the role they played in the overthrow. And it was ugly. It left me shaking. It was, the kind of thing you just want to wash that off. Don't tell me this awful stuff. You had no business being part of a violent insurrection. But that's the role we played. I went home. I didn't go back. I was disgusted by the whole thing. But it was obvious then we were on a path towards war. This didn't start with a, quote, unprovoked invasion February 24th, 22, excuse me. This started in February 2014, and it started with the U.S. participation in a coup.
According to reporting from the outlet The Times, German investigators are skeptical that Russian naval ships sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines this past September and are pursuing leads that, quote, point to Ukrainian authorities. Professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, David Sachs, joins us now to weigh in. Welcome, Professor Sachs.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
All right, so what do you make of this latest theory that it was, in fact, Ukrainian forces? And also feel free to reflect on that exchange in the airport that we watched just a second ago.
Look, I think that Seymour Hersh is the go-to source for the moment until proven otherwise. And the U.S. had the means, the motive, the timing, the bragging, the predictions that said if Russia invades, Nord Stream's not going forward. And Seymour Hersh gave us a blow-by-blow account. He explained that there are disgruntled people in the intelligence community that really were not happy with this, and they came to him. And the fact of the matter is, it's obvious that there are disgruntled people in the intelligence community because they've been also feeding information to the Washington Post and others that don't blame the Russians for this. They've been basically telling us that every smokescreen that was put up is just a diversion by the White House and the Chancellor's office in Germany. It's pretty clear what happened.
Despite, yes, it being at least somewhat clear to a lot of us, the mainstream media has just been, from beginning with theorizing that Russia did it, even though there was no real motivation there. And as you pointed out, our own U.S. officials had suggested that something would happen to Nord Stream. I've seen you interviewed in multiple places, in mainstream places, where I think you're greeted with a lot of skepticism, if not outright hostility, for taking this, for being a credible person who nonetheless takes this position that is so contrary to what, all the mainstream expert in national security intelligence kind of people are asserting. What has that experience been like?
Look at Radek Sikorski in that clip. Look, it's just a smirk on his face. This is power. Power says you don't have to explain, you don't have to apologize, you just have to smile. They're playing a game with us. And in fact, people tell me from leading mainstream media saying the opposite. Yeah, Jeff, of course it's the U.S. Are you kidding? But we should be grown-ups because, actually we'll blow up the world if we just think that everything is a game, that you can just lie, you can just get away with anything. And unfortunately, that is the attitude. It's a kind of superciliousness or arrogance that says, we don't have to tell you. And the New York Times wouldn't even deign to mention Seymour Hersh for weeks. Their own great investigative reporter, they wouldn't even mention what he had reported because they're playing a game with us. And I know because people tell me privately what they feel versus what is said in the mainstream.
Yeah, and that's so key, that people privately are conceding what you've been saying and what Seymour Hersh has been saying and what we've been saying, but publicly there's a total unwillingness to acknowledge basic reality. Is that because there's a fear of going against the administration's position that endlessly funding the Ukrainian resistance to Russia is an imperative national security objective that we will go along with, as long as it takes, even if it's an unreasonable goal that will just take us, forever or until the course of World War III or something like that?
It's a good question, which I try to understand myself every day. The New York Times, which used to be my go-to source from my youth onward, is miserable on the reporting on the war, on the reporting on Nord Stream. And there are different theories of why that is. One theory is that basically they're in cahoots with the U.S. government, and there's a lot to be said for that basic theory, and a lot of New York Times leaders have acknowledged that over decades. Yeah, we don't oppose the U.S. government on such things. Another idea is that in our social media world and in our subscription world, you don't make your base readers unhappy, that this would be uncomfortable. A third is that they're just, basically saying nothing against Biden because they're afraid of Trump. And so this is just simple partisanship, and that if this were Trump doing these things, they'd have their reporters all out there on this. I don't know which of these is true, really, or whether it's some combination of all of these. But what I can tell you is the reporting's awful, because they're just not even reporting the real debate. They're just wanting their readers to see one thing. I don't think people believe this stuff. That's the other interesting thing about the government propaganda, which is relentless. People don't actually believe it, but it gives them a way, like Sikorski just now, just to keep walking forward, just keep smiling, don't say a word. You don't have to talk to people like they're adults. Power is held by a small group, so we don't have to tell you anything. That's the real attitude of the government side, which is, we don't really care whether anyone believes it or not. It gives us something to say or not say, or a smile. This is really the attitude.
Do you think there are any cracks forming in the U.S. media's ability to basically paper over some of the realities that you're describing right now? I mean, some people believe that beginning to have reporting that says it might have been Ukrainians that did Nord Stream pipeline is like a slow creep toward an admission that obviously it wasn't Russia, a creeping admission that is U.S. or their allies, increasing pressure from countries like Germany, who are principally disadvantaged by the explosion of Nord Stream. Rising frustration from the global south that has been very vocal in its refusal to go hook, line, and sinker along with this, and the consequences for food supply and the like that have come because of this conflict. Can you speak a little bit to the geopolitical tensions that might slowly be eroding the U.S. media's ability to paper over what is going on in the region?
Well, there is really a horrible dead end to the path that we're on, because the war in Ukraine is very expensive. It's not going right. It's not going the way the U.S., the Biden administration predicted. They thought they were just going to scare Putin away, or that the sanctions were going to do him in, or that Russia wouldn't mobilize and so forth. None of it has turned out to be the way that Newland and Sullivan and others expected it to be. So things are going badly. You look at the G7 that just met, almost all of them have miserable approval ratings, really low approval ratings. That's a political fact right now. And as much as they propagandize day by day, realities on the battlefield, such as Russia's victory in Bakhmut after months at extremely heavy cost of lives and equipment, that's a reality. So now Biden's facing the re-election, and it's a very unpleasant position to be in. They don't know what to do. They're scrambling. So in this sense, there will be cracks that will open up a different kind of discussion, or they'll try to get a new line to freeze this thing somehow. They don't want to go into election year with massive spending on Ukraine, a battlefield at best stalemate, and at worst, much worse than that. So I think they are facing realities that they haven't shared yet with the American people, but those who watch this closely can only imagine how uncomfortable this is for an administration that had a very different idea about how this was going to go down.
And incredible that the New York Times is still disguising some of those realities. We talked yesterday about 2 consecutive stories in the Times where they said, well, yes, Russia took Bakhmut, but at such a cost, it was almost a defeat. Well, they still took it. And what's the cost for Ukraine? Just a really, really terrible thing that's happening.
Robbie, I've had experience with the New York Times. They absolutely will not report facts right now. And not just that, whatever they think are the facts, they won't let other opinions on their pages to keep the debate open. It's really extremely disappointing to me that they think that they can feed one line without what is at a minimum a real debate over these issues. They don't want to have that.
Yeah, I learned a lot in the process of being chairman of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission. So when I was asked, I have a fair amount of experience in public health. I helped to organize originally the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and had chaired a commission for WHO, and had worked on epidemic diseases. So I was very familiar with the community, and I was friends with Fauci, by the way, going back to 2001. I wrote him a memo why we needed a plan that eventually became PEPFAR, even with the number that I gave right at the beginning, that we need a $3 billion a year plan. And I went to brief him and Condi Rice and so forth in the first weeks of the Bush administration. So, okay, I was very honored to take on the assignment of chair of the commission. And I listened around and I thought, well, the scientists have said in an article in Nature Medicine in March 2020 that this was natural. Basically, they said irrefutably so, essentially. And I thought that was plausible because that's what pandemics are. They are zoonoses. That means they go from animals to humans, and that's what SARS was, and on and on. So I actually I hired the guy, absolutely fascinating. I didn't hire him. There was no money involved, but I asked Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, which is in the center of the
The villain of the COVID pandemic for a lot of people.
all of this. I said, Peter, why don't you be chair of our task force, not of the commission, but of the task force working on the origin of this virus? Because you know a lot about it. You know what's going on in China. You know about bat viruses and so forth. Okay, that's stepping into it. So I did. I stepped into it, and we started. And I started to get a bit of hate mail towards the end of 2020, which is not so unusual. But, you know, Sachs, why did you put this guy in, and a Republican congressman? This is disgraceful. And I wrote back saying, look, I'm completely open-minded, and I've given the assignment to them, find out the truth of what this is. And if it's from a lab, and if it's possible, we're going to track that down. And believe me, he doesn't make the judgment. There are 28 commissioners. I'm in charge of this and so forth. Okay. So you start seeing, because of the relentless work of this organization you started, The Intercept and U.S. Right to Know, we start getting strange things coming out, which is, but it took a long time just to get those first FOIAs coming out. And things start dropping that are a little weird. And then I got a wonderful briefing by a top scientist who explained to me, Jeff, it's, it's not what is being said. Let me explain to you the research that was going on. And I was like, oh my God. He explained gain of function research to me for the first time in 2 or 3 hours of pretty detailed technical work. And he said, go read the NIH proposals. So I went online afterwards and I read that aim 1 is to test these chimeric viruses in the following way. And oh shit, I got to figure out what's going on. So I went to Daszak the next day and I said, Peter, I need to see your full research proposal. And his line to me was, no, my lawyers say I can't share that with you. I said, are you kidding? We're in a commission that is a transparent public commission. No, my lawyers say I can't share that with you.
The most significant pandemic in almost a century.
So I said you're off the task force. Forget it. We're not going to have that. But all of that's a long way to say things started to be peeled back in a most remarkable way. I give huge credit to The Intercept and to U.S. Right to Know, and to a whistleblower who posted the decisive document, which is the DARPA Diffuse research proposal that was posted by a whistleblower that is almost a cookbook, how to make a SARS-CoV-2 virus. Well, this became rather a fascinating thing, because the more we knew, the more we could see that what those scientists had written was phony. That's first of all. Second, that Fauci had been lying. That was absolutely clear. And third, I have to correct you, Glenn, it wasn't 3 weeks, it was 3 days after the February 1 conference call where they said, I can't figure out how this could have come out of nature.
Right.
3 days later, that they have the first draft of a paper that's called Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2, which is the one that says it's definitely natural. And you know what?
And then anyone who thinks otherwise is a malicious disinformation agent and conspiracy theorist.
Right. And by the way, so the bottom line, this is a long story. It's absolutely fascinating. But the bottom line is the following. First, there's a weird part of this virus called a furin cleavage site. It's 4 amino acids, which make the virus highly infectious and deadly. Second, that was a target of known research. Third, it was the target of the DARPA Diffuse project. Fourth, it was a major target of University of North Carolina in partnership with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's obvious there's something to explain here. Maybe it's a weird coincidence. Maybe, and I think more than likely, It's part of the research gone awry. But not only did Fauci hide this, and also the public, as usual, didn't learn that already in the spring of 2020, the Department of Energy, because it's Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and Department of Energy was one, and another.
The FBI
had already found that there was a good chance that this was coming out of a lab, and
Right.
no one was telling us anything. I'm getting a bad echo right now, Glenn.
Oh, we're gonna try and fix that right now. Yeah, so they're going to work that, but I just want to say, go ahead. Go ahead. You finish your answer. You finish first.
Just to give you the bottom line, to this day, no Democrat in Congress will touch this. It's the weirdest thing. The Republicans say we need to investigate. I was just with Senator Rand Paul. He's done a great job of saying we need to find out what this is. He can't get Democrats on this because protecting Fauci or protecting Biden, I don't know what they think they're doing. How the heck did the origin of SARS-CoV-2 become a partisan issue? That is so weird, so strange, so unpleasant. And yet that's how our politics has basically disintegrated.
It's bizarre. Even totally, what should be totally apolitical questions, like a scientific question about the origin of the most significant pandemic in 100 years, whether we played a role with good intentions or otherwise in causing it to happen, is something that has just become completely polarized along left, right, or Democratic versus Republican lines. And I just want to emphasize, for me, the most amazing thing about all of this wasn't so much that there were key facts the government knew that we subsequently discovered. And I've become a big critic of The Intercept, and I do think they deserve credit there. My hypothesis is that they did that FOIA request with the expectation that it would debunk a lot of the claims about EcoHealth and Peter Daszak, and they got this material and it did the opposite. And, to their credit, they published what they got. Good for them, but it was the most valuable contribution to understanding this. It wasn't just that this information was kept hidden. People were banned by big tech policy from questioning Fauci's narrative about the origins of the COVID pandemic until the Biden administration itself came out and said, you know what, we also are uncertain about this and we're going to investigate. And only then did Facebook and then Twitter and Google say we're now going to permit a discussion of this. It wasn't just that the government hid information, they prohibited any questioning of it on our primary means of communication. All right, let me ask you, to conclude what I now officially consider to be part one of our interview and our discussion. But I do want to give you this chance to talk about this because it's something, you and I had the chance to discuss. I then went after our discussion and read a bunch of stuff and found where this is coming from. And it is not obscure sites, but as I said, the New York Times, I think the headline of the profile about you that I quoted was something like the Dr. Shock Doctrine or something like that, or, the idea that you were this leading ideologue of neoliberal cruelties, that you took distressed economies and forced the majority of the population to suffer for the benefit of the elites of those societies and international capital, that you are the avatar of neoliberalism and cruel disaster capitalism. And the Shock Doctrine is something so embedded in so many narratives. We had an opportunity to talk about why you regard that as a misperception. So I don't necessarily want you to walk through the whole history just for the sake of time, but I do want to give you a chance, since I have trifled with this belief in the past, something I absorbed uncritically, to go ahead and address why you think that's an unfair assessment.
It's not just unfair, it's completely silly. Completely silly. I wanted to read something that I said in September 1989 in the
New Yorker interview.
Interview with New Yorker. I don't know if you saw that.
I did, yeah.
I said, look, I'm no particular fan of Milton Friedman's or Margaret Thatcher's or Ronald Reagan's version of the free market. In the United States terms, I'd be identified as a liberal Democrat, and the country I admire the most is Sweden. Okay, I was a social democrat from a kid. A social democrat. So this whole idea of, now, the main thing I was trying to do, and succeeded in doing with Poland and completely failed with Russia was to try to get some financial help to a country in crisis. Because as we discussed, I had imbibed what I really regard as a wonderful and correct view, and I practiced it in my career successfully, a view of John Maynard Keynes in 1919 and the economic consequences of the peace, where he basically says, be nice to the country that's in distress, because otherwise you can really get harm. And of course, Keynes wrote that book in protest of the Versailles Treaty and said the way that the Versailles Treaty is going to squeeze Germany is going to lead to the rise of horrors in the next generation unless we do something different. Very prophetic, and I took it very deeply, and that's why even in my first outing as an economic advisor, my main pitch was cancel Bolivia's debts because it's in hyperinflation. Stop squeezing this impoverished country. That's how I came to be an advisor to Poland, because they looked, said, oh, can you help us with our debts? And I said, absolutely, I can. And I said to the White House, cancel Poland's debts. And lo and behold, they said, yes, absolutely. And I thought, God, I'm really so clever. You know, they follow just what I said.
And then on to Russia.
And then on to Russia. And I said, okay, we see how it works. Cancel Russia's debts. Hell no. Are you crazy? And so I didn't understand. I said, I gave good advice. I showed, you stabilize, you restore economic growth. But with Russia, nothing that I said was accepted. It had nothing to do with shock this and privatize. I wasn't even part of that stuff. I was trying to mobilize a debt standstill, which means you stop paying because you ran out of money, and permanent relief, and an emergency ruble stabilization fund, and finance for even, I think in that New York Times article, for healthcare. That's where I was spending my time on. We got to make sure the clinics are functioning. So everything that was said afterwards is so weird. But, one that pinned it on me was actually the Clinton administration, which did nothing. And then Strobe Talbot, in his clever line, said, too much shock, no therapy. And you know what? God damn it. He gave no therapy. He was in the government. I was pounding them, do some therapy, help. And they were doing absolutely nothing. And by the way, I just printed out in November 1991. This is before there's independent Russia. I said, now the Cold War and the collapse of communism have left Russia as a prostrate, frightened, and unstable, as was Germany after World War I and World War II. Inside Russia, Western aid would have the galvanizing psychological and political effect that the Marshall Plan had for Western Europe. Russia's psyche has been tormented by 1,000 years of brutal invasions, stretching from Genghis Khan to Napoleon and Hitler. I was pressing, that was my job, was to try to help get some relief. And this got weirdly conflated with all sorts of things, but the opposite of what I believed, completely the opposite. And I quit early on, as I told you, in the end of 1993, because I was having no benefit from, I could not get the United States to do anything. Neither the Bush administration nor the Clinton administration. They were, because already the neocons were in full sway, but I had no idea.
And wanted a weak Russia, and wanted a weak, crippled Russia to expand further. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me read you what I wrote in 2014 in BBC. NATO's continued desire, expressed again just recently, to add Ukraine to its membership, thereby putting NATO right up on the Russian border, must be regarded as profoundly unwise and provocative. And then I said, in 1914, 1989, 2014, we live in the spread of NATO and by U.S. bullying since 1991. Come on, this has been my position all along. You help a country in distress or you face consequences. But this country became nastier and nastier in its politics because our domestic political system went completely plutocratic and our foreign policy went completely hegemonic. And this is a disaster for us. This is where we are today. We have a plutocracy at home and we have a wannabe hegemonic rule abroad. Of course, it's so anachronistic. The whole world, other than a small part of the world, which is the European Union, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and Singapore. Those are the only ones on our side. All the rest of the world is saying, stop, we don't want a hegemon. We want normal cooperation. But we've lost it in this country because the politics are so damn corrupt at home, all driven by money, including the military-industrial complex, which is a major lobby pushing for NATO enlargement, NATO weaponry, everything. And then abroad, the Newland administration foreign policy, which is expand everywhere and overthrow governments that don't like where you want to expand.
It is remarkable just how the continuity of these policies, while we keep hearing these elections are the most important in our lifetime, the parties are so radically different they can't agree on anything, and yet there is this remarkable continuity, and that's the first thing I observed when I started writing about the Bush and Cheney administration, and I was moved by President Obama's passionate vow to uproot it all, and then I watched him not only uproot none of it, but expand and enlarge virtually all of it, and that was my sort of coming of age lesson. I really want to thank you.
I can tell you, Glenn, my wife and I love a biography, a documentary of Gore Vidal that was filmed towards the end of his life. And he's sitting in his villa in Italy on the night of Obama's election. And they announce on the screen Obama's won. And the cameras go up to Gore Vidal. Aren't you excited? And he's completely, no, I'm not excited. Why aren't you excited? He says, because by the time you've gotten to be president, you've sold your soul so many times, it makes no difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he was somebody who, used to be enamored of Democratic Party politics, a friend of the Kennedys and the like, and then he finally saw enough, and he became a super interesting figure by the end of his life. Again, thank you so much. This was definitely as enlightening as I expected and knew it would be. I'm very much looking forward to at least part 2, and we'll see how much we get through the other questions I had and the topics I wanted to discuss. But I really appreciate your time, and I hope to see you again shortly.
Hey, phenomenal. I'm going to hold you to part 2 because it's a lot of fun, and I'm learning a lot from you, so it's great.
Mutually. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, negotiations are continuing in Washington, D.C. over raising the debt ceiling. The United States faces a default on its debt in early June if a deal is not reached between the White House and Congress. On Tuesday, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy privately told Republican lawmakers he was, quote, nowhere close to an agreement with the White House. McCarthy and President Biden had met at the White House Monday after Biden cut short his trip to Asia. McCarthy's pushing for sweeping budget cuts and new work requirements for recipients of government programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. The Republicans, however, are not proposing cuts to one of the biggest drivers of the nation's debt, the massive U.S. military budget. According to the Cost of War Project of Brown University, U.S. wars since the September 11th attacks have cost over $8 trillion. A separate report by the group estimates 4.6 million people have died since 9/11 as a result of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Somalia. And over the past 16 months, Congress has approved more than $113 billion for Ukraine following Russia's invasion. We're joined now by the economist David Sachs. He's the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, has served as advisor to 3 UN Secretaries General, currently serves as a Sustainable Development Solutions advocate under Secretary General Tony Guterres. He recently wrote an article headlined America's Wars and the U.S. Debt Crisis. Professor Sachs, welcome back to Democracy Now! Well, why don't you lay it out for us? Talk about what's happening in Washington, the historic possibility that the U.S. could renege on could possibly not lift that debt ceiling, and what that means, and how that fits into the budget that Republicans want cut and the budgets they not only want not to cut, but to increase.
Well, great to be with you. It is startling that since the year 2000, the debt that the U.S. government owes to the public has gone from about 35% of our national income to nearly 100% of our national income, or GDP. And that has been dramatic because we have been engaged in nonstop wars, literally since the start of this new century. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and now Ukraine. And we have spent a fortune, but no president has said to us, these wars are so important that we should pay taxes. They've just put it on the borrowing. And as that Watson Institute study has shown, and that you cited, the one at Brown University, these wars have cost us around $8 trillion. That's direct military outlays, that's ancillary costs, that's the veterans' medical expenses. This has been a very significant proportion of the rise of this debt. Another significant proportion was the financial sector, the Wall Street bailout in 2008, and the pandemic costs. But the wars have been a huge deal, and it's bipartisan. This isn't Republicans or Democrats. Neither party wants to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that we are currently at an incredibly destructive, disastrous, and I would say avoidable war. The toll is rising, of course, in destruction and human lives, but also in outlays. You mentioned the $113 billion, and there's more to come if this administration gets its way. They're not talking about this in these negotiations. They're talking about cutting help for the poorest people in this country and to continue the warmongering and feeding the military-industrial complex. That's why I wrote the article, because it's shocking. It's both parties that are not talking about the real issue here.
And Jeffrey Sachs, if you could talk as well, you talk about these as wars of choice, what you mean by that, and also the issue of the pressure now to modernize the U.S. military to face potential conflicts with China as another strategic plan that will result in more military spending in the future.
These are not only wars of choice, the ones that I mentioned, they are wars of lies, because we've never been told the truth about what these fights are about, why we're doing it. Of course, Iraq famously was on completely phony pretenses, but that's not the only one. All of them have been based on lies. When it comes to Ukraine, we knew, our diplomats knew and warned that the continued pressure by the military-industrial complex to expand NATO to Ukraine would provoke war. But they never told the American people that. They never explained it. And till this day, they haven't explained what this war is really about. You think about Libya, again, lies, no explanation, violation of the UN Security Council. Not only was the whole Syrian effort a lie of the United States, it's never even been explained to the American people that this was an operation that President Obama ordered the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government. It failed, but it was extremely costly and destructive. So these have been wars of choice and wars of lies. They are pushed by the military-industrial complex. They are pushed by neoconservatives in both parties. Now we have new drumbeats of war, not only as if Ukraine was not devastating and threatening enough with nuclear annihilation. Now we're talking war with China. Unimaginable. It could end the world And yet this is normal discourse in what passes for grown-up discussion in Washington, which is not grown up at all, in my opinion.
And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Ukraine. You've written often about this whole way that the American top officials in the U.S. government, as well as the media, talk about the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion as unprovoked. This whole issue of being an unprovoked war.
I noted that the New York Times has used the word unprovoked regarding this invasion 26 times in its editorials, its opinion columns, and its invited guest op-eds. They don't talk about the truth, which is that our own diplomats, I'm talking about U.S. diplomats, including CIA Director William Burns, who wrote a memo that was released by WikiLeaks in 2008. His 2008 memo said, this is existential from Russia's point of view. If we continue to push NATO enlargement to Ukraine, this could have absolutely dire consequences. Our diplomats have known this all along, but it's been the politicians, it's been the military-industrial complex, it's been the big companies that have been championing NATO enlargement. That's a lot of weapon sales if you do that. Even though the risks are completely understood inside the government by serious people, they're just not heeded. And this has been true about Ukraine all along. And up until the end of 2021, Vladimir Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement that was based on don't expand NATO to Ukraine. And that has been Russia's refrain for 30 years. And yet we don't heed it. And now we're 113 billion into this. It is because this isn't going to work out well for Ukraine. It's a disaster. It's like how it worked out for Afghanistan. So this is what's really going on. And I wish that the New York Times would carry some truth in this to explain what this is really about.
Well, Jeffrey Sachs, you also have been critical of Russia's brutal invasion. And I'm wondering how you see this ending now. And also, as we started, if you could talk about how you see this debate on lifting the debt ceiling ending.
Well, this war is going very badly. There were tens of thousands of deaths in this Bakhmut battle just now that Russia has won and Ukraine has lost. And the estimates are that just this one narrow battle cost billions and billions of dollars, not to mention the disaster of how many deaths. So they're running through money like there is no tomorrow. And if we're not careful, there will be no tomorrow. We need to negotiate a stop to this war, whether it's an armistice or a real peace agreement. That is what China's saying. That's what Brazil is saying. That's what South Africa is saying. That's what India is saying. Major countries around the world that aren't part of this NATO-Russia conflict are saying stop before this completely engulfs the whole world, which it is at risk of doing. So I think that moving to negotiations now, whether it's stopping the fighting and freezing the lines, whether it is really a peace agreement based on Russia leaves and NATO doesn't go in. This has been the core issue from the very beginning. This is feasible, and the world is demanding it outside of this so-called Western, what's really NATO and U.S. allied world versus Russia. So that, I think, is how we could spare lives, save the world, and help the budget, by the way. When it comes to these negotiations on the debt ceiling, I really hope that these negotiators face up to the fact that our military budget, which is 40% of worldwide military spending, is brought dramatically under control, because that's really how to save money. We are 40% of the world total military spending right now, and more than the next 10 countries combined. We've got to get this military industrial lobby under control, but it's hard to do because it's a bipartisan affair. The Congress and the White House on both sides is beholden to this seemingly all-powerful lobby. But this all-powerful lobby is driving us to ruin.
And Jeff Sachs, I have one final question about the both the wars in Afghanistan that the United States, where the United States backed the Mujahideen forces against when the Afghanistan was occupied by the Soviet army. Many of those guerrillas that the U.S. backed ended up returning to their Arab and African countries and became the basis of jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda. There was the unexpected blowback of that U.S. support of that war in Afghanistan. Are we potentially seeing a similar blowback from the war in Ukraine, which has been a country that's become a magnet even before the Russian invasion for neo-Nazi and ultra-right groups from Europe and even the U.S.? Could these foreign fighters now battling in Russia and Ukraine become a danger to European democracies in the future?
Of course, and it's a very well put point, but I would say something even more stunning about this. It used to be said for decades that the U.S. backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to confront the Soviets who had invaded Afghanistan. But Zbig Brzezinski let us know the truth a few years ago before he passed away, and that was that the U.S. supported the Mujahideen first as bait to induce the Soviet Union to invade. We started it. We started arming an insurrection to help pull the Soviet Union into an invasion in Afghanistan. It's shocking in its cynicism, and it left that country at non-stop war and destruction from 1979 until today, a completely ruined, wrecked, hunger-ridden, famine-ridden society more than 40 years because the U.S. was playing a covert game with all the backlash that you note rightly, that it created Al-Qaeda, it created so many disasters down the road, but it started as a great game, as if this were a game. I've seen so much now of the U.S. destabilization of other countries. It's disgusting, and it's just not covered. And by the way, just to give you another journalistic, weirdness, I was friendly with Aristide in Haiti. I liked him. I wanted to help him. He said to me, "Jeff, they're going to get me." And I thought, oh, come on, no, they're not going to get you. I'm going to help you. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. It's going to be fine. No, they're going to get me. And okay, I didn't get it. Then, of course, Bush stopped all World Bank loans, IMF loans, Inter-American Development Bank loans. They used the usual financial squeeze to break him, but he remained there and he remained popular. So they eventually threw him out in a coup, and they landed a plane with an unmarked tail, and they stuck him in the plane and they flew him to Central Africa. Okay, I knew a bit about what was going on, and I called the New York Times reporter. I said, there's a coup in broad daylight. Would you cover this? And you know what I was told? The editor's not interested in that. A coup in broad daylight, and the editor's not interested in covering that. That's actually how it went down. And then I testified in Congress a few days later to a committee where everyone swore how much they loved Haiti. And boy, it was so good that Aristide was taken out of harm's way that the United States saved him by flying him out. You can say anything in this country right now. I mean, our government can say anything in this country, that 6 people in a yacht or a rowboat blew up Nord Stream. You say anything, and the New York Times sucks its thumb and says, yeah, that's what an unofficial senior senior official said, unnamed senior official in the United States government said, that seems right. And that's how we are right now. No one's talking, no one's thinking.
So I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about that specific media part. Before I do, let me just, on the substance of Ukraine, a lot of times people say, I don't understand what they're really trying to do is make some rhetorical point about something not making sense. That's not the way in which I mean this. I genuinely don't understand the following. Neocons obviously were kind of catapulted into a position of power in Washington after 9/11. All their dreams, invading Iraq and having regime change plans for the broader Middle East, were all being empowered. And with the disaster that they ushered in, that everybody recognized, the foreign policy community kind of said, all right, we're done with these crazy people for a while. The second term of the Bush administration kind of reined them in. Obviously, Obama was elected on a promise to reject neoconservatism. And for a long time in Washington, it wasn't just people, like you or like Noam Chomsky, but I mean like very sort of middle of the road, centrist, mainstream people like Bill Burns, like President Obama, like Donald Trump, whose view was Ukraine is not a vital interest to the United States, that vital interest doctrine always being central to how we formulated our foreign policy, what we were and not willing to go to war for, that it's always going to be a vital interest to Russia, but not to Ukraine. That was what Obama eloquently argued. That was what Trump also argued in his own kind of Trumpian way. Biden was part of that Obama administration. That was clearly the position of the Biden administration, of the Obama administration. Now here we are, to the extent that I could discern any interest that we might have had in provoking the Russians into that war, it was accomplished in the first week or two when we got the Europeans to disassociate themselves from Nord Stream and start buying our own natural gas. That was mission accomplished. And yet here we are a year and 2 months later, a year and 3 months later, there's clearly no attempt, none, on the part of the U.S. government to try and negotiate a peace deal. In fact, they blocked them when they emerged. And we seem to be getting deeper and deeper and deeper involved into this war, which at the end of the day is about nothing more than who will rule certain provinces in eastern Ukraine or what will be their status. What changed in Washington that has made bipartisan Washington, not just neocons, but the vast majority of the establishment wings of both party and the Biden administration so committed to this war, seemingly with no end in sight?
Yeah, Glenn, I think the part that can help on this is that the neocon part never went away, and it was core to the Obama administration. It wasn't foreign to the Obama administration. And let me just illustrate, nothing was really reined in. Remember, 2008, the last year of Bush Jr., was when the commitment of NATO made at the Bucharest NATO summit that NATO would enlarge to Ukraine and Georgia, by the way, was made. So nothing was reined in at the end of the Bush administration. People should look on a map, by the way, Georgia, and not Atlanta, Georgia in the Caucasus. What's Georgia doing there, for heaven's sake? Well, if you look at the map, the plan is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounds Russia in the Black Sea. That's the idea. So that was there consistently from the early 1990s. Brzezinski explained it in 1997. It continued to be U.S. policy in 2008. Then comes the Obama administration, but Obama supports lots of war, and this is not well understood. But it's not well understood. You had Hillary, of course, who I don't know if she ever saw a conflict she didn't want to get more deeply into. But for example, Syria. It's never been explained to the American people. Syria was not a civil war. Syria was a U.S. CIA-led regime change operation that went terribly wrong. And we actually, in our mainstream press, say, Russia came into Syria. How dare they do that? We were in Syria in 2011 with CIA to overthrow Assad. I happen to know, again, because of my role in diplomatic circles, that in 2012, there was an agreement to end the fighting in Syria, but it was blocked by one party. You know who that was? That was the United States.
I was going to guess.
Everyone else agreed to a framework that was being put together by the highest diplomacy. The U.S. blocked it. The mediator talked to me at one point. Jeff, you cannot believe it. It's one government. It's the U.S. which insists Assad must go the first day. Everyone else wanted to do something pragmatic to stop the fighting. The fighting ended up going on many years. At the end of that year in 2011, there's NATO bombing and ending up, driving to his death and creating another decade of real civil war and outside war. Libya, killing Muammar Gaddafi. It was the Obama administration, Victoria Nuland as Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in February 2014 that participates in the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. So Obama, he had some important good sense in 2014, said, I don't want to get more deeply into it, but it was his administration that played the role that triggered this thing. And how much analysis have we had from the New York Times? I may come back to my favorite newspaper over my lifetime. Nothing. No word about any of this, how this really played out. So the odd part is Trump, it stops in this weird way. I don't even know what those years meant exactly. It's so weird. But there were no new wars. Biden comes in, and it's important to understand, in 2014, when Nuland is caught on the tape, what does she say? How's this deal going to close? She says, I got the VP waiting, and she's talking about Jake and the VP. So the team, which is Biden, Sullivan, and Nuland, they each had one rung lower on their jobs in 2014. You had a vice president. Jake Sullivan had the same job as national security advisor to Biden, but Biden was vice president, not president. And Nuland was assistant secretary, not undersecretary, but it's the same group. So the underlying continuity is the main point. And really something I've, basically learned over time, because I didn't get it. These ideas and plans actually go back 30 years. That's weird. But, when a historian tells you, oh, no, Ukraine's already on the list in 1992. And you have in the wonderful memoirs of Bill Perry, written, I think, 2016, 2017, when he says, I thought about resigning from the Clinton administration because I really opposed the NATO enlargement. That's all the stuff that, we're just not brought into, except after the fact. This is not democratic deliberation. This is, you try to somehow parse these details and you get snippets of it, or you happen to be in circles that someone explains something to you, or you see something, or you hear something, but you can't figure it out from what anyone is saying on the surface, because this stuff is not for the American people to understand. They're just supposed to understand that in February 24th, 2022, there was an unprovoked war by a crazy megalomaniac.
The new
That's
Hitler.
The only
the
thing
new Hitler.
So
this really does lead into the media component, and I just want to ask you about that because I also want to talk about COVID without taking up all of your time tonight. But we played a video of you last night, actually, with Robert Wright, where you were essentially expressing shock that the media has become such an arm of the U.S. security state that they're even willing to say things that are laughable on its face, like trying to convince us that Russia blew up its own pipeline, just like they wanted to convince us that Russia drone bombed the Kremlin. Everything's a false flag when Russia does it, but you can never suggest the U.S. did anything as a false flag, or you immediately get relegated to the sector of being a crazy conspiracy theorist. A main reason why I started writing about politics in 2005 was because I had perceived the corporate media was way too subservient and deferential to the narratives of the U.S. security state when it came to the war on terror. That was a big criticism of mine from the start. It's gotten so much worse now. In 2004, the New York Times came out with a pretty historically significant mea culpa saying, hey, we know we helped sell that war in Iraq, and it was because we were too uncritical about what the security state was telling us, and we're never going to make that mistake again. They're in another universe now in terms of their willingness to write down whatever the CIA tells them to say, even when they know it's false. And I want to understand why. My hypothesis is that Trump really did change everything. His election made a lot of people in elite media circles believe that we were facing this kind of singular threat, this new Hitler. I think they talked themselves into that, and that anything and everything became justified in the name of stopping Trump and his movement because nothing is more dangerous. And they saw correctly the CIA, the FBI, the U.S. security state as allies in the war against Trump because they perceived Trump as very valuable. That's where Rushgate come from. And they, in that alliance, became so deferential, way more so than ever, that they're willing to say almost anything. And yet here you have, you know, a very serious war by all accounts, no matter where you fall on the side of it. And I don't even think Iraq was as drowning in propaganda as the war in Ukraine is. It's not just propaganda, it's just completely false narratives to the point where they say laughable things like that pipeline example. I know these questions of why did this institution get corrupted, why are they like this, is always hard. You're talking about a lot of people, there's probably mixed motives. But what is your view about why these media outlets, almost to the point where you can ask a lot of people inside of them who will admit that it's happened, become completely abdicating in terms of their supposed core mission of being adversarial to these agencies?
That's why I listen to you to try to understand this, because it's not a grown-up thing. And I had the strange experience just after Nord Stream was blown up that I ran into a classmate and friend and someone I really like, a top journalist in the U.S. Okay, a New York Times journalist, because I've mentioned it. I don't want to mention his name, but a friend. And I said, hey, you know, I think the U.S. did this. And he said to me, of course the U.S. did this. Who else? And I said, yeah, but your paper said this morning it was Russia. He said, oh, yeah. I said, come on, this is serious stuff. And he batted it off again. And I said, you know, it's really serious. And when you and I were at school together decades ago, we had the Pentagon Papers, we had Watergate. I lived on the New York Times every day, you know, loving it. That's how I grew up. And he said to me, that paper is so dead and gone. It's so depressing to hear that from one of the leading journalists, because this guy's a very talented guy. But the fact of the matter is, they would not cover this Nord Stream story until today. And, you know, the joke of it was when Cy Hirsch made his piece, and perfectly sensible, explained a lot. And by the way, explained that this madcap thing of blowing up the pipeline was so stupid and so reckless that top intelligence people turned to Hirsch because they thought this is crazy what the White House is doing. So that even that is perfectly
And there's
sensible.
no other way anymore to get their dissent out. No one will print
The
it.
The New York Times would not even mention Cy Hirsch's story. And then, of course, it was, I don't know, months later that they had some absolutely absurd, it wasn't even a 12-hour news cycle of a few people in a boat. And, you know, a few people in a boat that couldn't even have an anchor when the water is 270 feet deep. So the whole thing is so completely absurd, but they played that story. But I think, you know, one of the things, Glenn, that impresses me about all of this is it doesn't really fool many people. It's not like this is believed. The confidence in the media is rock bottom. It just gives something to avoid talking in some way. It's not that they say, God, we really got them now. They really believe this absurdity. And today, I think it was today, you had Radek Sikorsky, who tweeted just after Nord Stream was blown up. Thank you, USA. And he's walking through an airport and a reporter shouts out to him, hey, why did you tweet thank you, USA, with the picture of the pipeline? And he smiles. And they call again and he smiles because the truth is they don't need to discuss this. This is just arrogance. What do they have to?
They're laughing at their ability to
this?
Deceive the public. They're laughing at the fact that they can simultaneously admit it and then continue to deny it. Ted Cruz was openly giggling with Victoria Nuland at a Senate hearing about how happy they were that this is now a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea, which Biden and Nuland explicitly threatened that they were going to do this multiple times. And I do think on some level, part of the power that they enjoy is their ability to sell the most preposterous stories because they don't even have to be bothered with trying any longer to answer to anybody because the media will never insist that they do.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter whether anyone believes it or not. So they're not even trying to sell clever stories. They're just selling stupid things or smiling. We don't have to answer anything. But how is it? And I need to ask you, in the White House newsroom, how come there isn't somebody there that's calling out real questions? Is it just that they don't get called on, or that to be in the pen or whatever it is, the pool, I should say, that you don't stay there if you actually want to find out something?
Yeah, I think a big part is, one of the things that really struck me is during Russiagate, when I was questioning a lot of those original stories and a lot of the stories overall, I was getting lots of messages from journalists inside every single one of these major newspapers and major digital outlets saying, thank you so much for what you were doing.